Hello, I'm Will and this is Mike and we're the Tabletop Donkeys.
Hello.
And welcome to the first episode on the new Warhammer 40,000 Combat Patrol magazine, the new Warhammer 40,000 Partworks magazine by Games Workshop, published by Hachette Partworks, which comes with a Space Marine captain in Terminator Armour and a Winged Tyranid Prime model. To start off our first two Combat Patrol collections, this magazine over the course of 90 issues will come with 9 complete combat patrols for the Warhammer 40,000 game mode of the same name. So in this video we'll be looking through the magazine at the build instructions and the lore section, and then playing the introductory scenario that comes in the magazine, where we'll be putting our new models on the table and beginning to learn how to play the game Warhammer 40,000. So we'll start off by having a look inside the magazine. Well, on the left-hand side, we've actually got the contents page, which tells you what is going to be in each magazine. There's also a little word from the editor. And then our first article is how to build our new models. If you're familiar with the previous magazines from Hachette Partworks, this is actually a slight change of order. So there's some basics of how to build these models here. So how to use some clippers. If you're a subscriber, you will have received some clippers with your first delivery, I believe. So these are what you need to get the model off the plastic sprue that it comes on. And as it says here, the sprue itself has numbers on it to tell you which part is which number, which you'll need for the build guide. And here your mould line remover, which you will also receive to your subscriber, which you can use to scrape down the mould lines on the model. You do get some slight mould lines on models sometimes, which is inevitable, but they can easily be removed with the mould line remover or a small file or a knife as well, if you're careful. And then it also has some guide on using glue. You don't get any with the collection itself, but you can buy some from your local Warhammer store or another good hobby shop or online. And you want to use polystyrene cement with these models, commonly called plastic glue, because it sort of melts the plastic parts together and forms a strong bond. You don't have to use glue for these specific models because they're push fit. They have pegs with holes that they go into. We would generally recommend glue though, even so, because it makes them a little bit sturdier. But for right now, especially if you don't have any glue straight away, you can just push them together. And we have the guide for the Space Marine captain in Terminator Armour. He has a fair few parts, but the construction process should be fairly straightforward if you follow this guide carefully. And he only goes together in one way, so if he doesn't look like the model shown here, all the bit on the front, then you might need to check and make sure you've actually got it correct. He also has a large scenic base that pushes into the holes on the round base that you get, and then he himself has some pegs that go into the holes on the rubble that he's standing on. And then the guide for the Tyranid Prime. Again, there's a few parts here that you have to be careful exactly how you line them up, but just check the pictures at every stage if you're unsure to make sure that it looks like what it's supposed to. But then we move on to an introduction to the lore of the Warhammer 40,000 setting. The game is set in the 41st millennium, so if you consider we're in the 3rd millennium now, obviously quite a long time in the future, where humanity has expanded across the galaxy, but it's hardly a pleasant place to live for the majority of people. The Imperium of Man being beset on all sides by aliens and mutants, and from within by corruption and the forces of chaos. Defended by brave warriors, but nevertheless it is a time of war and misery, where human society has degraded to one of superstition in place of enlightenment and progress. And on the next page, there's a little bit about the Imperium itself, as it says, a brutal and warlike empire dedicated to the worship of the God Emperor, its ruler. It has numberless armies, most of them made up of ordinary humans, such as the Astra Militarum, but also the legendary Space Marines that we're going to learn about in a second. The forces of chaos, as mentioned, worship gods, which come from the warp, which is essentially a sort of hell dimension. Many mortals turn to chaos in exchange for the promises of power, although this often costs them their souls and often their sanity as well. But if they please their gods, they may be gifted with dark and terrible powers, or even the assistance of the gods' demonic servants. And finally we have the Xenos, which is the in-universe term for the various aliens and non-human species of the galaxy. There's a picture of the warlike orcs here, but they're also the technologically advanced Tau, the mysterious Eldari of various factions, the ancient Necrons, and of course the Tyranids that we'll be learning about in a second. Now we have the Space Marines. These are genetically modified super soldiers created by the Emperor himself in a bygone age, but now split up into more than 1,000 chapters, brotherhoods of essentially warrior monks. When they go to war, they're a finely honed instrument using powerful technologies and their transhuman gifts to defend humanity. Typically, their chosen form of war is the surgical strike, the application of extreme force with great precision. Within a chapter, there are many specialists capable in all forms of warfare, deploying various squad types, weaponry and vehicles, depending on the battlefield situation. And then we learn about the Tyranids, a terrifying alien foe thought to have come from beyond the galaxy that functions as a sort of all-devouring swarm, completely overwhelming anything that stands in their path and then devouring it and rendering it down to its base biomatter to then be recycled and turned into more Tyranids. They are controlled by a hive mind and cannot be reasoned with or communicated with in any way. As you can see here, Tyranid beasts range from huge monstrosities all the way down to chittering swarms that overwhelm the enemy with endless numbers. Now we move on to a bit more about the collection. So we've got a page here for the captain in Terminator Armour. So there's a table you can roll on here. Roll a dice to give him a name if you want to, and also a little backstory. We'll be doing that for all the models we receive, and we'll tell you about them when we get to the game, when you see the models on the battlefield. There's also some tick boxes for when you've built, painted, and played a game with your models. We don't have any painting instructions yet, but those will come later. Space Marine captains are the leaders of companies that make up a Space Marine chapter, and they're all seasoned warriors, commanders, and tend to lead from the front, inspiring their battle brothers with their great deeds. And over the page we have the datasheet for the captain, which gives all the rules that you'll need to use this model in your games of Warhammer 40,000 Combat Patrol. As it says here, don't worry if this appears to be a lot of information right now. All of this will be explained as we go through the issues in simple steps, so if you're new to the game, it will all be made clear. There's a little bit at the bottom which actually explains what Combat Patrol is. It's a simple way to play the Warhammer 40,000 game using a fixed force for your faction, using the full game rules but with a fairly compact battlefield and set of objectives. So it's a great way to get into the game, hence the focus of this magazine. Then the same for the Winged Tyranid Prime. These are some of the mid-sized Tyranids perhaps, not a huge monster but also a large and powerful creature in its own right. These are an example of what are called synapse creatures, which exert the will of the hive mind over the smaller organisms using a psychic link. These particular ones are winged and have deadly talons, so they sweep across the battlefield to engage the enemy. Again, there's a table you can roll on to give it a name, although rather than a personal name, these are more like sort of nickname for the creature and how it prefers to fight. And there's its data sheet over the page. But now moving into our game content for this issue, I'm going to hand you over to Mike. He will take us through the basic rules for this introductory scenario, and then we'll play a couple of games for you with our new models.
So here we are, welcome to Warhammer 40,000, a game like no other, a game of epic battles in the far future, although in the beginning here we're just starting off with one model each, with our new Space Marine captain in Terminator Armour and the Winged Tyranid Prime. As we'll start learning the beginnings of the game. It will be fairly slow to begin with, again it is aimed towards beginners and will follow the rules set by the magazine, so if anything seems odd if you're a veteran player, that will be why. So we can go over some of the core concepts. In the game there are models and units. So the Space Marine Captain is a unit consisting of one model, whereas those Termagants are a single unit made up of 10 models, and often units have to stay together and have rules regarding them, but we'll learn those later on. And we use six-sided dice. Sometimes you might be called on to roll a d3 though. So there's a little table there. Basically a 1 or a 2 is a 1, 3 or 4 is a 2, 5 or 6 is a 3. If something says roll 2d6, you roll 2 dice and usually add the result. Models can be destroyed, representing them taking too much damage or being heavily wounded so that they can no longer fight. Once a model has taken too much damage, it's destroyed. And so you use wound markers, which are on the back cover of the magazine. We'll use dice though. And so we can go on to our first mission, First Strike. Up at the top we have a little bit of narrative, so this is a duel between the Tyranid Prime and the Captain on a remote outpost that seemingly has been attacked by the Tyranids. And deployment, we have our battle map, and both models are just going to be placed in the middle next to each other to represent them being in a melee combat. And how we tell who wins is when one model is slain. Both models have 6 wounds, we'll learn what that means in a bit. And once a model has lost all of its wounds, as we learned before, it is destroyed. And your rolls represent the sort of narrative. It's a good idea to try and imagine what is actually going on. It's not just clinical dice rolling. You imagine that they're swinging their weapons, ducking, dodging, taking heavy blows and so on. Got to use your imagination a bit. So now we can go over the battle sequence, and essentially all either of our characters are going to be doing is attacking, and the attack sequence is broken up into 3 steps. First you roll to hit, then you roll to wound, and then you roll saves for the target. So the Winged Tyrant gets to go first, has 6 attacks, so he rolls 6 dice and he hits on 2s, so rolls of 2 or better are successful. And then you will take those successful hits, and you need to see whether they were hard enough hits to wound or if they hit something important. The Prime has a strength of 6 with his talons, which is higher than the Captain's toughness of 5. We'll learn what all that means later, no doubt, but essentially we need to know that the Tyranid Prime wounds on 3s or better, and then you take those successful rolls, and then the Space Marine Captain has to make save rolls, make sure his armour saves him. So 3 or better on his save rolls are successful, and each successful wound causes 2 damage, and the Captain has 6 wounds. And then the Space Marine Captain gets to go. Follows the same sequence, but some of the numbers are a bit different. Again, the Space Marine Captain has 6 attacks that hit on 2s. However, he only wounds on 4s, because he's not quite as strong as the Tyranid. However, the Tyranid's armour is much worse than his Terminator Armour, so it only saves on a 6 or better. And then we'll just keep going until one combatant has been slain. And skipping ahead a bit to the back page, you can see these are all the wound markers you can cut out. Again, we're going to use dice. And you can see the whole collection here as well. You can find pictures of this online if you want to get a nice clear view. So here we are on the battlefield of this far-flung outpost. We have Captain Marius, or Marios is a more suitably Silver Templar name, and I've decided that the Tyranid Prime will be called the Archaven Horror as well. It's a bit more interesting than Specimen 45. Throughout this magazine, because we'll be using different factions at different times, I'm going to be using white dice throughout, and Will will be using red dice throughout, just in case you're watching and not paying total attention. You can tell who's rolling dice for what. But now we can actually just get into the game, where the Tyranid Prime will get to go first. So I roll 6 six-sided dice, and I'm looking for 2s to hit with his talons. So those are all successful, that is 6 hits. And now I take those dice and need to make wound rolls, so looking for 3s. Well, that is 6 successful wounds.
And now I need to roll my save rolls to see if any of those get through the armour of the captain, and I'm looking for 3s or more, so 1s and 2s are bad. Well, there are actually 4 1s and 2s there, and every hit does 2 damage to the captain, and he can take up to 6 wounds before he's killed. So obviously 4 failures means he will take 8 wounds and actually be killed straight away.
Yeah, so we'll obviously play that again. We'll play through a few times. Perhaps the captain will be a bit more lucky, just so we can see what he can do. So we've reset, and we'll do the Tyranid Prime again, just following the magazine, just see if maybe he's not quite so lucky this time. Again, 6 dice to hit, looking for 2s. So they all hit, and 3s to wound. Well, only 5 this time.
So again, we don't want to see 1s and 2s. Right, so we've only got 2 1s this time, so that will be 4 damage in total, and since the captain can take up to 6 damage or 6 wounds, we'll mark that down as having 2 left. The magazine convention is to mark down how many wounds he's suffered, but we prefer to do it this way. We'll do that going forward, so the number on the dice will always be how many wounds they can take before they die. So the captain gets to strike back. He also has 6 attacks, which also need 2s. But we have a 1, so 5 hits there. But 4s he needs to wound the Tyranid Prime. Still got 4 of those though, that's not a bad roll.
Man, the Tyranid Prime is looking for 6s to save, because his armour clearly is not as good as the Terminator Armour. And he failed them all. So he'll take 8 damage, because the Captain's Sword also does 2 damage per wound. So that will kill the Tyranid Prime, and the Captain is victorious. So for game 3, we'll let the captain go first this time.
Yep, so he hits on 2s, but we've got 2 1s, so we're not doing as well as before. And with 4s to wound, we get only 1, so he's not going to kill the Tyranid Prime this time.
Yeah, so only 1 6+ save, or 6. No, the Tyranid Prime fails, so he has 4 wounds remaining. Still has 6 attacks though, because being wounded doesn't hamper him. And he gets 1 miss, looking for 3s. Getting 4 wounds on the captain.
And again, we're looking for 3s or more. We got 1 failure, so the captain is also down to 4 wounds left, or 2 wounds taken.
And then we go back around to the captain.
6 attacks once again. We all hit this time, no 1s there. And 4s to wound. 5, we've got a good roll again.
Yeah, going to need a lot of luck to survive this. Well, he did make 2, but that sadly is not enough. That'll be another 6 damage, easy enough to take you out. So I think maybe we'll leave it there. That should give you a decent grasp on how melee combat works. And obviously if you have multiple models or multiple units fighting at once, it does get a bit more complicated, but this is the core way attacks are resolved. So this is what we'll be building on in future issues. And just before we jump into the issue recap, we also have a thing on the back page showing the outcome of each side's victory. Saying the Space Marines victory, even though the Tyranid Prime is defeated, it's just a part of a much larger swarm. Whereas if the Tyranid Prime is victorious, the Space Marine Captain manages to get away despite being heavily wounded, and will obviously be back for revenge later on. But now we'll recap these games and this issue for you now. Well, that was several games for issue 1 of Warhammer 40,000 Combat Patrol. I mean, there's not an awful lot to talk about. Obviously, we have played Warhammer 40,000 for quite a while. If you've followed our channel, we've done 2 other magazines of Warhammer 40,000, so this will be fairly similar to those. We'll go through it, playing the games from a beginner's perspective, and it is very good for learning how to play the game. We will try to keep it so that we play the same Combat Patrol each time. So I will be playing the Tyranids, and we'll be playing the Space Marines. We'll see how the new combat patrols are introduced, what happens. We might end up dropping and changing, but we'll try to use the same coloured dice each time so you can tell which player is rolling. But yeah, there isn't too much to say about these games in particular, although I suspect the captain was just very unlucky in the first game. I would expect him to beat the Tyranid Prime most of the time.
Yeah, I think these are the actual rolls you would normally need when these two would fight in melee. It is slightly simplified in some respects, but the numbers are correct.
It is interesting they mention strength and toughness and give you the exact values straight away, although you do get the full data sheets fairly early on. The magazines are generally very good at easing you into the rules.
Yeah, and over the how many magazines they've done now, they've refined how they've done that and what speed to introduce you to the rules. So probably within 10 or 12 issues, you should have a fairly good representation of the basics of the game and a fair few units to play with as well. Obviously, this magazine is different in the collection in that rather than getting 2 armies, we get 9 small complete armies or combat patrols. I can see why they've done it because it gives an introduction to a game mode that is designed to be played quickly with not that many models, which is good for beginners, but also the beginnings of multiple armies, so you can kind of pick whichever one you like best to take into the larger game, I suppose.
They're all good starting points, and I guess also it's easier to get other people into the game. If only one person gets the magazine, they can introduce other people to it that way. So it'll be interesting to see whether the first 20 will be Space Marines versus Tyranids, and then we'll start completely new ones.
Yeah, we don't know exactly what they're planning to do yet, but talking about these 2 models, it makes sense, I suppose, to have 2 characters as the first issue, because then you get 2 models you can start with who are both leaders of their respective combat patrols, so to have them from the start and be able to fight is kind of cool.
Yeah, and they are both pretty cool models. Possibly a bit complicated for an absolute beginner to put together. Maybe some fiddly bits like getting the captain's body and head lined up, or maybe all the Tyranid's limbs.
Excluding the extra models, both the Space Marine and Tyranid combat patrols are all models you get in the starter sets, so they are single pose models that are a little bit easier for beginners to put together. Being push fit, you can put them together without glue. It just makes them easier to assemble, which is good for beginners. And generally these magazines, they have been quite good at making the models beginner friendly, at least to begin with. Some of the later combat patrols will be a bit more complicated. Some of those do include multi-part models with lots of options, but that is the sort of thing you develop into in the hobby anyways. And of course we are using fully painted models. At this point, if you're literally starting off from nothing with the magazine, you won't have any paints or even any painting advice in the magazine yet. That will come soon, but for the purposes of the camera it looks much nicer to have them painted.
Yes, and they do advertise that there will be more lore for the Silver Templars in this magazine. Obviously I've painted the Marines as the Silver Templars. They were sort of the mascot for Conquest magazine, the very first magazine we ever did, and they were sort of like the channel mascots almost. So you will be seeing them again. But obviously the magazine will probably going to tell you to paint Ultramarines as usual.
Yeah, the magazine painting guides will be specific for each faction, and you don't have to paint them that way, but the painting guides will be very basic to start with and take you through all the steps learning how to paint.
Don't be intimidated if you think these models are, oh, those are really well painted, I can't do that. You can. Anyone can do it. You just need enough practice and time. Oh, and obviously it's an extremely good savings for these 2 characters. I'm not actually sure if you can buy them separately, but I think you can get them in some of the starter sets. But this is even better saving than those.
Yeah, so you can buy all of the combat patrols that you get in this magazine in a box, so the Space Marine or Tyranid combat patrol, plus some additional models that are shown on the poster that was in the magazine earlier.
Also, some of the combat patrols you get with this magazine are actually older editions of them, like the Gene Stealer Cult one. Some of the combat patrols are not the same as ones you would actually buy off the shelf. The Space Marine and Tyranid ones are the same as the ones you can go out and buy now. But anyway, I don't think there's more to say. Leave any comments if you're getting combat patrol, and leave any thoughts or anything you want to see from the series. We've been the Tabletop Donkeys, and we'll see you in the next one.
Bye for now.